Mafia boss saw single mom's daughter cleaning at 2 a.m. The truth about her bruises broke him. I woke in the hospital with the sharp scent of antiseptic still clinging to the air, and the distant beeping of the heart monitor echoing like it was traveling up from the far end of a long and empty corridor. Each breath sent a piercing ache through my chest until tears slipped out on their own, as if someone had taken a hammer to every one of my ribs. 5 hours earlier, Derek had beaten me until I could no longer breathe. Not for any clear reason, only because the chicken burned, because of a message from a coworker he thought looked suspicious, because his voice kept rising while mine grew smaller, and because Ellie, my daughter, only 12 years old, stood in the bedroom crying without sound, too terrified to run to help her mother. The nurse said I had 3, maybe 4 ribs badly damaged, pain medicine, scans, observation, all things I knew I could never afford. The bill had already climbed past $300, and every minute I stayed in that room added more money I did not have. I signed the discharge papers while still in agony, just to hold on to the small piece of control life rarely gave me. My phone lay silent on the rolling table. When I turned it on, the screen showed 2:47 in the morning. My cleaning shift at the Romano estate began at 6. For 5 years that job had been the only thing keeping the two of us from being swept under by the world. I knew their rules well. One absence without warning meant being fired on the spot. I called home. 6 rings. No answer. Worry rose in my throat like something too large to swallow. I called again. Still nothing. Where was Ellie? Did the neighbors hear the phone? Who was watching her while I lay here? Another nurse walked in, looking exhausted as though she had lived an entire night in the past few hours. You should not leave the hospital. The doctor wants to observe you a few more hours. I have to go. My daughter is home alone. She hesitated a moment before speaking. Your daughter left 2 hours ago. She said she was running home to bring you some things. My whole body went cold as if dropped into ice. Ellie left the hospital alone near midnight. Why did you let her go? She is 12. I could not keep her. She said the neighbor would meet her at the gate. She was calm and very determined. Calm. Ellie was never calm around strangers. Not when she was scared. Not so late at night unless she had a reason. Unless she was trying to protect someone. I pulled the IV from my arm and pushed against the bed rail to stand even as the room tilted around me. I had to find her. The nurse called after me, her voice edged with worry, but I was already stumbling toward the elevator, one hand pressed to my chest, the other dialing Ellie, the neighbor, anyone who might know where she was. No one answered. But then, with the instinct only a mother knows, I understood where my daughter had gone. She had gone to work in my place. Ellie had gone to the Romano estate. I took 3 bus rides to get there, each small jolt of the road sending a sharp flash of pain through me, blurring my vision for a heartbeat. When I reached the back gate, the kitchen lights of the estate glowed bright. Shadows moved inside. I had not even touched the door handle when it opened. Anthony, the longtime driver for Mr. Romano, stood there, his face as unreadable as ever, though his eyes held an alertness I had never seen. "Mrs. McKenna," he said with a tight urgency. "Mr. Romano was about to send someone to look for you. Ellie, is she here? Is she hurt? She is in the kitchen with Mr. Romano. Please come in." I stepped inside, my knees weakening from pain and fear. The sight before me nearly stole my breath. Ellie sat curled on a chair in the corner of the kitchen, wrapped in a thick blanket. She held a cup of hot chocolate in both hands, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to this world. Her wrist showed bruises blooming in yellow and purple under the light. And standing beside her was Jack Romano, the man I had worked for over 5 years, yet had rarely dared to meet his eyes. The man whose silence, everyone said, was more dangerous than any shout. He looked at me, his dark gaze cutting through every layer of defense I had built over the years, seeing every secret I had buried. "Mrs. McKenna," he said in a voice quiet yet sharp as a thin blade, "you should sit before your body gives out." I stood there breathing hard, pain burning through each breath, knowing that my life was tipping toward a direction I could not yet imagine. If you're listening and something in this story has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom channel, click like, and share this video so that its message can reach even more people. Every day, we bring you real-life stories filled with emotion, made especially for those who are searching for a source of strength. Where are you tuning in from? Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching, so we know this story has made its way to your heart, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you for being with us. And now, let's continue with part 2 of this journey filled with tears, hope, and unshakable courage. The pain in my chest forced me to brace one hand against the cold white wall of the hospital hallway as I tried to walk, each breath pricking my lungs like a needle. If not for Ellie, I might have surrendered on that hospital bed and let everything fall where it would. But the moment I remembered my daughter had vanished into the night, my legs moved again on their own, trembling and unsteady. I had signed the discharge papers, though the doctor refused to approve it because I could not bear the thought of being confined while my daughter was somewhere unknown. When the elevator doors closed, the beeping of the monitor still echoed in my ears like a lingering warning. The hospital at night felt unnervingly quiet. Faint yellow lights stretched long, uneven streaks across the tiled floor. Outside the glass doors, the sky remained thick with darkness, and the air seemed to solidify between the buildings that hovered in the early hours before dawn. I held my chest, trying to keep my breath from breaking into a moan. 3 ribs bruised, maybe 4. I repeated that to myself each time the pain blurred my sight. But the physical ache was nothing compared to the fear swelling inside my chest. My phone lit up each time I tried to call Ellie, only to fall back into the hollow ring of voicemail. My hands were stiff with cold and shaking hard enough that I nearly dropped the device. I called the neighbors, hoping someone heard something, hoping someone happened to see Ellie, but no one answered. The familiar illness of panic began rising. It felt exactly like the moments when Derek slammed the door, locked it, and let his rage take over. The feeling of being cornered with no escape, not knowing what would come next. Except now the person left behind was Ellie. She was only 12 years old. She should never be alone in the streets at night. And the nurse's words kept echoing in my mind. She was very calm. Ellie was never calm when she lied unless she had a clear purpose. She would never leave the hospital unless she believed it was the only way to save something, or save me. I stopped before the large glass door leading outside. The cold wind rushed in and forced a cough out of me, the pain spreading like a wave through my chest. But as I looked at the dark streets and the scattered night buses, I knew I had no other choice. I grabbed the railing and stepped down the stairs, one painful step at a time, each movement cutting like a blade, though the fear for Ellie was sharper than any wound in my body. When the first bus arrived, I nearly collapsed into the seat, wrapping my arms around my middle as though holding myself together. The lights flickered overhead. Few passengers slept with their heads tilted, and the driver paid no attention to the trembling woman sitting in the middle row. I looked at the clock, 2:53 in the morning. Less than 3 hours before my shift at the Romano estate began. Ellie knew that. She understood how important that job was, knew that losing it would leave us with nothing. That was why she had gone in my place. The thought squeezed the air from my lungs. She had grown up in fear, and in the shadow of Derek's anger long enough to understand how thin the line was between surviving and falling apart. She had left the hospital because she believed it was the only way to protect our future. Tears slid down my face as the next bus rattled along the road. I pressed my forehead to the icy window. Outside, the city of New Haven lay smothered in darkness, empty streets stretching out beneath scattered street lamps that looked like faint trembling dots. When the third bus finally stopped near the wealthy neighborhood where the Romano estate stood, I could hardly feel my legs. I dragged myself forward in silence, each heartbeat a whispered plea. Let nothing happen to Ellie. Do not let her pay for mistakes that were mine. Standing before the back entrance of the estate and seeing the bright light inside, I knew my life had already crossed a line that would not allow me to go back. I walked down the narrow path leading to the rear of the Romano property, the cold wind whipping against my face with a sting like tiny needles. Every step was a trial. My ribs hurt so sharply that I had to stop halfway and lean against the iron fence just to catch my breath. But no pain could overpower the rising dread filling my chest. I called Ellie again. The phone rang once, then twice, then fell silent. Refusing to believe what I heard, I dialed again, waiting for her small trembling voice to answer, but all I received was the flat tone of voicemail and the long drawn-out beep that tore at my thoughts. I tried calling my neighbor, Wendy from the floor above, who once told me to reach out if anything ever happened. 6 rings passed. No answer. I tried another number, then another. Every attempt ended in the same dead end. My hand holding the phone felt frozen while my heart felt colder still. A fear began taking shape inside me, slow and certain like darkness seeping through a doorway. Ellie had not simply gone home to fetch a few things. She was not the kind of child to wander alone in the night, unless she was driven by something that left her no choice. And I knew what that was. She had heard the nurse mention the hospital bill. She had seen how I fell apart the last time I lost a job. She understood deeply that missing one morning of work could send us out onto the street. I remembered her eyes before I fainted. Not only frightened but calculating, searching for a way to do something far bigger than any child her age should attempt. Ellie was bright beyond her years, a quiet observer, always watching. She knew where I worked, she knew my schedule. She had watched me pack my cleaning bag, polish my shoes, and once joked that she would do my job for me someday. I swallowed hard, trying not to break down in the middle of the street. My phone lit up again, warning of a low battery. I pressed call once more. Ellie, it is Mom. If you are somewhere, please answer. Please. You do not have to carry this weight. You are only a child. I am fine. We will be fine. Just come back. My voice cracked on the last word and blended with the faint sounds of a half-sleeping city. Far off, a taxi slid past, leaving a brief trail of golden light on the uneven pavement. Part of me hoped she had been stopped somewhere safe, that someone had taken her in, but the rest of me knew with painful clarity that Ellie had gone to the Romano estate. It was the only place that made sense to her, the only place that had held our fragile balance for 5 long years. I pressed my cold trembling hand to my chest where the ache still throbbed. This was no longer only the hurt of broken ribs. It was the fear of a mother about to face something she never imagined possible, and I was afraid that after this night nothing in our lives would ever be the same. My steps began to slow as I reached the end of the narrow alley that opened onto the main road, my breath catching as if something inside me was being squeezed shut. The phone lay silent in my hand. Not a single answered call, not a single message returned. Each time I whispered Ellie's name into the receiver, a primal fear stirred in me, the kind only a mother who has lost the trail of her child in the middle of the night can understand. I leaned back against an old brick wall, trying to inhale deeply, but the sharp pain shooting from my ribs dropped me to my knees, my hand gripping my leg as if it might hold my body together. Ellie was gone. From that moment on, every rational thought I had bent beneath the weight of rising panic. She was only 12, and if she had left the hospital, alone, in the cold night, this was no reckless act. Ellie was never the kind of child drawn to exploring dark streets after hours. She feared the night, feared sounds she could not place, feared facing strangers without me beside her. Unless she was running from something even more terrifying. I remembered the last moment before I passed out at home. Ellie stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, clutching that worn teddy bear. I had heard her voice catch when Derek shouted, the sound of her feet running to the corner, the slam of the door closing behind her. Maybe Ellie thought I would never wake up. Maybe she believed that if I lost my job, we would have nowhere else to go. I forced myself up, bracing one hand against the wall and willing my feet forward out onto the main road. The night buses had grown few and far between. Here and there, drunk men stumbled along the sidewalks. A few police cruisers rolled slowly by. The pale yellow streetlights stretched my shadow long and misshapen across the pavement. I scanned every corner, hoping for a glimpse of Ellie, but she was smart. And when Ellie wanted to disappear, she would go to the only place she believed held a solution, the only place she ever called safe, the place where I worked, the Romano estate. I pulled my thin coat tighter around me, the hospital gown beneath doing nothing to block the wind. With every painful step, I redialed Ellie's number, my voice raw and cracking with desperation. Ellie, if you can hear me, please pick up. I'm not angry. I just want to know you're safe. I'm coming for you. Please. My legs felt like stone as I made my way toward the nearest bus stop. The distance from the hospital to the Romano neighborhood was far, but I had no choice. A taxi at this hour was more than I could afford. I climbed aboard the first bus, arms wrapped around my chest, the pain flaring with each bump in the road. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror but said nothing. Occasionally, passengers came and went at different stops. Each time the door opened, cold wind rushed in and made me shiver uncontrollably. I looked at the time. 3 o'clock in the morning. The world outside the window was a dark, desolate blur, lit only by the glow of late-night shops and the rhythmic blinking of traffic signals. Where was Ellie in all that emptiness? Was she cold? Was she scared? I placed a hand over my stomach, pleading with myself not to collapse before I found her. I had no right to be weak now. I had to find her, no matter what it took. When the final bus stopped near the Romano neighborhood, I stepped off, my knees threatening to buckle. The estate stood ahead, quiet yet imposing, nestled among the elegant homes of New Haven's wealthy district. A light flickered in the kitchen beyond the trees, a sign that someone was awake. My heart pounded against my aching ribs. Ellie was there. I knew, it as surely as I knew my own name. I staggered toward the back gate, my fingers trembling as they touched the lock. If I opened that door, I would be stepping into a reality I was not prepared for, but could no longer avoid. I whispered a prayer I wasn't sure I believed in. Please, let nothing have happened to Ellie. And then I pushed open the gate and entered the world of the man I had not dared to look in the eye for 5 long years, unaware that this night would change everything about the life my daughter and I had known. When the back gate closed behind me, the faint creak of its hinges slipped into the stillness and sent a shiver along my spine. The Romano estate rose before me, imposing yet quiet in the depth of night. Every window was dark except for the kitchen at the far end of the house. A soft yellow glow spilled onto the damp stone of the back patio, stretching long across the ground. A part of me wanted to call out Ellie's name, but my throat closed before any sound could escape. I was afraid of hearing something worse than silence, or worse still, hearing nothing at all. I walked slowly, each step sending a sharp ache from my chest through my entire body. The gravel under my feet crunched loud enough to make me feel as though even my smallest movement disturbed the sleeping air around me. I had never entered this place from the back. In 5 years of working here, I always used the side entrance for staff, arriving quietly and leaving the same way. Tonight, I felt like an intruder stepping into a world that had never belonged to me. The kitchen light remained bright. The thin curtain was drawn back, and I could see a shadow moving inside, though I could not tell who it was. I moved closer, my heart pounding so fiercely it felt as if it might be heard through my skin. A kitchen light at this hour would not have been unusual at dawn, when everyone stirred for the day, but this was the middle of the night, and the only person I prayed was the reason, for that light was Ellie. I raised my hand to knock, but before I touched the door it opened from within. A tall, solid figure filled the doorway. The light behind him sharpened his features, making his expression appear more severe in the glow. I recognized him instantly. Anthony, the loyal driver who had served Mr. Romano for years, a man of few words who showed nothing but discipline and silence. He looked at me without the slightest hint of surprise, as if he had been waiting and knew I would come. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "Mr. Romano was about to send someone to look for you." My breath caught in my throat. "Ellie," I stammered, not caring how ragged I must have looked. "Is she here? Is she hurt?" He gave a small nod. "She is in the kitchen, with Mr. Romano. Please come in." That sentence chilled me more deeply than the night wind. Ellie was in the kitchen, with Jack Romano, the man I had served for 5 long years, the man I had never dared to look in the eye, the owner of this estate who remained distant and reserved, whose silence employees often found more unnerving than anger. Even those closest to him said he allowed no one into his private spaces after hours. I crossed the threshold, my head spinning from pain and fear. The scent inside the kitchen was familiar yet richer than usual, perhaps from someone warming chocolate. I turned and felt my heart stop. Ellie sat curled in a chair at the corner of the kitchen table, a gray blanket draped over her shoulders. She held a steaming cup of chocolate in both hands, her eyes wide, dry of tears yet exhausted. And what nearly brought me to my knees were the bruises on her wrist, stark against her skin in shades of deep blue and fading yellow, a quiet accusation needing no words. Standing beside her was Jack Romano. He wore a black sweater and said nothing. One hand rested lightly on the back of Ellie's chair, the other hung at his side. His face was unnervingly calm. His eyes were not. His gaze cut through me as if everything I had hidden for years had been laid bare with a single look. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice not loud but firm and unyielding, "you should sit before your body gives out." And in that moment I knew nothing in our lives would ever return to what it had been before. I do not remember how I managed to sit down. It felt as if my legs moved on their own, obeying the command in that voice. In that gaze I did not have the courage to face a second time. Jack Romano remained standing where he was, unmoving like a carved figure in the quiet kitchen. Only his eyes felt alive, deep, sharp, and heavy, with things I could not begin to understand. Ellie stayed silent beside me, the cup in her hands gone cold long ago. I reached out and touched her shoulder. "Ellie, I am here now." My voice came out as little more than a whisper, dry and fragile as though I had forgotten how to speak. She did not answer, only leaned the slightest bit toward me, not in fear, but as if she had been waiting for someone to finally touch her. Her eyes lifted toward mine, then dropped again. A part of me felt relief to see her there, still my small Ellie, but another part inside me screamed with questions I could not form. I wanted to know what had happened while I lay helpless in the hospital, why she had come here, why those bruises marked her skin, but sitting across from Jack Romano. I could not begin speaking as though I were talking to someone familiar. He did not need to raise his voice or show anger. His silence alone made the whole room feel tight and airless. I had never imagined facing him this way. In 5 years of working here, I had seen him only in passing, when he walked through a hallway or stepped into a room while I was cleaning the windows. He always dressed simply yet impeccably, never wearing anything unnecessary, never making small talk. The staff called him the man who could quiet a room with a single glance. Now I understood why. "Mrs. McKenna," he said again, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your daughter arrived here at nearly 3 in the morning. She knocked and asked to come in to clean the kitchen." I swallowed hard. I did not know what she had done or said, but hearing it from Mr. Romano cut through me like a blade. "I am sorry. I truly did not know she would do that. I did not allow it." He remained still, then slowly pulled out a chair and sat across from me. For the briefest moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger and not disdain, but something closer to confusion or pain. "Ellie did not need to tell me anything," he said softly. "I saw the bruises, and the way she looked around the room as if searching for a place to hide. I had no choice but to send someone to find you." I said nothing. The room fell into a thick quiet where I could hear every slow tick of the wall clock. 100 answers formed in my mind, 1,000 ways to protect my daughter, to protect the story of our lives. But under that gaze, I had nowhere left to hide, and for the first time, I understood that Jack Romano's presence was not only power, it was something that made a person unable to lie to themselves. I sat motionless in the chair for a long moment, the faint warmth from the cup of chocolate in Ellie's hands drifting into my fingers as I held her, and the fact that she did not pull away was the only thing keeping me from collapsing entirely. The kitchen light no longer felt harsh. Jack Romano had stepped back, giving the two of us space, though he neither spoke nor left the room. He stood beside the counter, arms folded, his expression thoughtful in a way that seemed to belong to a private world only he understood. I did not dare ask why he had not ordered us out. Honestly, I had braced myself for it. I had prepared to hear the cold reprimand I surely deserved for allowing my child to slip into her employer's home in the dead of night. But Jack Romano said nothing, and that silence unsettled me far more than any accusation could have. Ellie remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the table. I lifted her hand gently and studied the bruises on her wrist. Old marks layered beneath new ones, shades of blue and yellow forming a map of pain she had never spoken aloud. I swallowed hard. "Ellie, why did you come here?" She did not answer at once. When she finally spoke, her voice was small as a passing breeze. "Because you had no one to watch you. If you did not work, you would lose your job. I do not want to go back to the shelter." I closed my eyes. Her words cut into me with a clean, merciless sting. She remembered everything. She remembered the day we were forced out of our tiny apartment because we could not pay the rent. She remembered the nights in the shelter waiting room, when I held her close so she would not hear strangers arguing through the thin walls. Ellie remembered, and she had carried a burden that was never hers to carry. A soft knock echoed at the kitchen door. It was Anthony. He stepped inside, holding a bag of medicine and a warm cloth. "Mr. Romano asked me to bring these for you and the girl." I turned toward Jack. He still stood by the window, not looking away. I took the bag, overwhelmed by confusion. "Thank you," I murmured. Anthony nodded, set the bag down, and left without another word. I opened the bag, soaked the cloth in warm water, and gently pressed it against Ellie's bruises. She winced but made no sound. I wondered how many times before she had done this alone, quietly, while I was gone. I kept my voice steady. "Tonight I will not leave your side." She nodded, and for the first time since I entered the kitchen, she rested her head against my shoulder. Only a little, but enough to tell me she had been waiting for that comfort longer than she could say. Jack Romano stepped closer and stopped on the far side of the table. "Mrs. McKenna." I looked up. His eyes, still cold in their steadiness, held something different now. "Ellie may stay. Here tonight. You as well. There is a spare room for staff on the upper floor." I was not sure I had heard him correctly. "You truly allow that?" He nodded. "Only for one night. In the morning we will talk again." I squeezed my daughter's hand. One night. Only one night, yet it meant the world. A night when I could hold my child, rest in a place that felt safe, and breathe without the constant weight of fear. A night without slammed doors or looming threats, without wondering whether tomorrow would strip away the little stability we had left. Ellie remained against my shoulder. I kissed the top of her head, and for the first time in years I whispered a thank you, soft enough that only I could hear it. Thank you for her being here. Thank you for this single night. In this house, with the man I once believed would never open his heart, I learned that some silences carry more compassion than any spoken words. I do not remember how I was led to the room, only the soft sound of the dark wooden door closing behind me, and the long moment I stood still inside a space that was unfamiliar yet strangely warm. The room was small and tidy, with a single bed set near the window, a low bookshelf holding a few worn English titles, and a table lamp casting a gentle golden glow across the walls. It was not luxurious or dazzling the way one might imagine the home of a powerful man to be. It felt instead like a room meant for someone who needed rest, a quiet corner for shelter in the midst of turmoil. Ellie had fallen asleep on the bed before I even realized it. I tucked the blanket around her and sat at the edge, watching her small face soften by sleep after a long night. It was a face I knew by heart, a face I loved beyond reason. Yet under this unfamiliar light it looked like a reminder of how I had allowed her to grow up in a world she should never have had to endure. Once I was sure she slept deeply, I slipped out of the room and down the stairs. My heart was still tight, with worry, but another feeling stirred quietly beneath it, as though I had stepped across the threshold of something I could not yet name. Jack Romano was still seated at the kitchen table. The overhead lamp cast his shadow long across the surface, still and deliberate. A cup of cold coffee sat by his hand, beside a thick file he had not opened. When I entered, he lifted his gaze, and it was no longer as sharp as before, almost softened. "Do you need anything else?" I shook my head and drew out a chair across from him. "Tonight. Thank you for letting us stay." He did not answer, only set the file aside and folded his arms, his eyes drifting toward the kitchen window. I had always believed I understood him, a reserved employer, always distant from his staff, speaking only when necessary. But now, in this quiet pool of warm light, I saw another version of him. A man who did not speak much, yet acted at the exact moment he should. A man who could read fear in a child's eyes and respond, not with hollow reassurance but with action. "I thought you would be angry," I said, trying to steady my voice. "When you learned Ellie came in the middle of the night, when you saw her like that." He looked at me then, his expression faintly shadowed. "I was once a child like that." His words stunned me, not because of what he revealed but because of the gentle way he said it, without drama, as if it were a truth requiring no explanation. Silence settled for a breath before he continued. "My mother died young. My father did not care whether I ate dinner or had a place to sleep. I learned how to survive before I learned how to read. Perhaps that is why I understood what was happening with Ellie within minutes. I had no response. Every phrase of gratitude felt empty in comparison. For a brief moment, the distance between us did not feel like employer and worker, but like two people who had survived their own pasts, each holding tightly to what little they had left. Mr. Romano poured water into the kettle and filled 2 cups with hot tea, ginger tea, the kind I often drank but had never mentioned aloud. I looked at him, surprised. "You knew I liked this." "I pay attention," he said simply. His voice was not cold, not rigid, only calm, as though he had been observing me far longer than I ever realized. When I returned to the room upstairs, Ellie still slept, but this time her breathing was steady and peaceful. I lay beside her and wrapped my arms around her small body. In the darkness, with her warmth pressed close, I closed my eyes and understood that perhaps for the first time in years, I would not wake terrified in the morning. Perhaps in this cold place I had stumbled upon a small corner of warmth I never dared to believe could exist. I woke in the middle of the night, the soft light from the bedside lamp casting faint patterns on the ceiling above. Ellie was still sleeping soundly in my arms, her breath steady and warm against my skin. The room was quiet, safe in a way, that brought tears to my eyes. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in years, I had not been startled awake by the slam of a door or the heavy footsteps of someone drunk and angry, not lying there straining to guess from which corner of the night disaster might come. In that stillness, my thoughts drifted backward, carried on a quiet tide toward someone I had not thought of in a long while. The first man who ever made me believe love was real. David. His name has always lived in my heart like a summer breeze passing through a sweltering afternoon, never loud, but always leaving behind a hush of comfort when I remember him. I met David in the spring of the year I turned 21. He was not tall or striking in the way that draws second glances, but his smile had a way of making the world feel lighter. David was the first person to see how hard I was trying, not just a poor, orphaned girl juggling 3 jobs to survive. He worked at the city library, and I cleaned it early every morning before the doors opened. Sometimes, I would catch him standing by the front desk, a half-finished novel in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He always greeted me by name, never once called me the cleaning girl. When I got sick and missed a few shifts, he asked how I was. When I returned, he brought ginger tea in a thermos and an old knitted scarf he said his mother made years ago. Loving David was never dramatic, never burning like stories in a romance novel, but it was strong enough to make me believe my life might finally find steadiness. We married a year later. No wedding dress, no ceremony, just 2 people standing before a courthouse official, hands clasped, promising to face the hard days together. 3 years after that, Ellie was born. David cried the first time he held her. He said he might not have much to give her, but he would teach her to be kind, to grow up knowing that no matter how the world turned, someone would always choose what was right. But doing what is right is not always met with kindness. The accident happened on a rainy afternoon. David was on his way home when a truck ran a red light and struck him head-on. The driver was drunk, held for only a few weeks before being released. I lost my husband, Ellie lost her father, and from there, everything began to fall apart. Without David, I did not just lose my emotional anchor. I lost the only person who ever believed in my worth. I had to leave our rented home, leave my job because I could not manage childcare alone. I battled through each day, each bill, each glance of pity from strangers. There were moments I wished I had been taken with him, in that crash. But then Ellie would cry, call me Mama, and I would remember I had no right to collapse. I used to believe I would never open my heart again. No one could ever replace the space David left behind, the man who taught me how to love, how to trust, how to give without asking for anything in return. But tonight, as the memories return, I understand that love does not die with the one who is lost. It changes shape. It lives on in Ellie, in the way she tries so hard the way her father once did. And maybe, just maybe, it lives in the quiet, unfamiliar parts of someone like Jack Romano. I do not hope for miracles, but I am beginning to believe that something, however small, is slowly lighting again inside the heart I thought had gone cold. And if David is somewhere out there, I believe he is smiling, knowing that his wife and daughter are still finding the strength to keep going. After David died, I tried to hold myself together, but the days that followed felt like an endless series of steep hills with no place to rest. I became mother and father at once, a woman who no longer had the luxury of being fragile even for a moment. Ellie was too young to understand the fullness of our loss, yet she felt the emptiness in the way my eyes dulled, in the hoarse edge of my voice after nights of silent crying. I tried to return to the library, but my old position had been filled. No one blamed me for being gone too long. They simply could not wait for someone like me. I worked wherever I could find work, cleaning in the early mornings and waiting tables at night. On some days I brought Ellie with me, and she would sit quietly in a corner with her teddy bear, sounding out letters from a children's book while I washed dishes or scrubbed floors. But the money I earned was never enough to pay rent on time, let alone afford insurance or good food. Then Derek appeared, offering what felt like a lifeline to someone who had begun to drown without realizing it. He worked for a heating and cooling company and came to repair the old furnace in the apartment I once rented. When he learned I was a single mother, he talked more, brought pastries for Ellie, asked if I needed help watching her when my shifts ran late, sometimes drove me home after dark. In a moment of weakness, I convinced myself that perhaps God was offering me a second chance. I did not love Derek. I was far too exhausted to tell the difference between genuine affection and the mirage created by loneliness. Derek was nothing like David. He did not listen, did not truly see Ellie, but at least I was no longer carrying everything alone, and that felt like enough to allow him into our lives. At first, everything was quiet. Derek did not cause trouble and did not raise a hand, but after a few months he began to change. He drank more, anger flared faster, jealousy arrived without cause. If I spoke with a stranger for a single minute too long, Derek interrogated me as if I were a criminal. Once I came home late because Ellie had a fever and needed a doctor, and Derek stood waiting by the door, his face flushed with fury. He did not shout. He simply looked at me, threw the keys to the floor, and walked inside, leaving me to hold Ellie and cry through the night. Arguments grew more frequent. Each time I pretended Ellie heard nothing, pretended nothing was happening, and I learned to hide everything. Makeup to cover the circles under my eyes, excuses for the bruises on my arms, extra hours at work just to avoid going home. I knew Derek was dangerous, but I had no money to leave. The lease was in his name. My wages could not cover a deposit anywhere else. Whenever I mentioned leaving, Derek turned sweet in the worst possible way, buying toys for Ellie, cooking dinner, apologizing, promising change, and then the cycle began again. I slowly believed I had no choice but to endure, as long as Ellie was not hurt. But I was wrong. The shouting, the slammed doors, the threatening glances, all of it was harm. Ellie saw everything. She learned to stay quiet, learned to shrink into corners, learned to disappear so no one would notice her, just as I once had. By the time I realized it, she had begun hiding her own bruises, and I understood that if I did nothing, she would walk the same dark path I had. But then, I did not yet have the strength to leave. All I could do was hold her tightly every night and pray that someone, or something, would lift us out of the darkness. I never imagined that the answer would come from the place I believed would always remain cold, a mansion built of distance and silence, a quiet man with watchful eyes, and a single gaze deep enough to see the hurt I had buried for so many years. I was preparing breakfast in the Romano kitchen when the gate bell rang, long and urgent, nothing like the calm way people in the house usually signaled one another. Ellie sat on the high chair in the corner, stirring her milk while her eyes stayed fixed on me without blinking. She felt the shift in the air too, the instinct of a child who had learned to live on alert. I dried my hands and stepped into the back hallway, where Anthony and 2 other men from security were already moving quickly toward the side gate. Life inside the estate was usually handled in silence, without commotion. Yet today the air felt thick with tension. I walked to the window and lifted the curtain slightly. Standing at the gate was Derek. His hair was disheveled, his jacket wrinkled, his staggered stance revealing he had been drinking, even though the morning was not yet past 9. His arm waved toward the house, his mouth moving in slurred shapes no one could hear, but I knew he was calling my name. Derek had found me. I had known, somehow, that he would track me down. Not because he cared, but because Derek despised losing control. He could not bear that I had left without permission, without a note, and worst of all, with Ellie. I turned back to my daughter. She still sat in her chair, but her small hands gripped the edges so tightly her knuckles whitened, her lips pressed together, her eyes wide. Ellie knew the signs of Derek's anger all too well. But this time it was not happening inside a cramped apartment, not in a place where no one intervened even when things broke and shattered. This time we were somewhere else, and I was no longer alone. A voice behind me made me start. It was Jack Romano. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable though his voice was cold as winter air. "Take the girl upstairs." I nodded, took Ellie's hand, and led her to the room on the upper floor. Before closing the door, I looked back for a moment. Jack still stood where I had left him, motionless as a carved figure, yet I felt a rising tide beneath that silence. I had barely shut the door before the growl of an engine rose from below. From the second-floor window, I watched Anthony at the gate. He positioned himself in front of Derek, needing no force at all to stop him from advancing. Derek's voice rose in sharp, angry bursts. He pointed toward the mansion, shouted my name, demanded to see Ellie. His face was flushed, his eyes wild. I had never seen anyone stand in the path of Derek's fury without flinching. But Anthony did not move, and when Jack stepped into the courtyard, everything shifted at once. He did not raise his voice. He spoke a single question. "Who are you?" Derek hissed, thrown off guard. "I am her boyfriend. She took my daughter. I have a right to see her." Jack did not answer. He walked closer, his gaze locked on the man standing before him, assessing him, stripping him of every false claim. "A right," he repeated, though his tone was not a question but a judgment. Then he gave the order to Anthony. "Remove him from this property. Make sure he does not return." There was no argument, no shouting match, only a command delivered with the certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. Derek screamed threats, curses, rage spilling in every direction. But within minutes the roar of an engine carried him away from the estate grounds, disappearing beyond the iron gates that closed with a heavy echo. I stood there, one hand gripping Ellie's shoulder. She trembled but did not cry. I knew she too was, waiting to see what came next. But this time I did not have to hold her tightly to shield her from a storm no one could stop. Someone else had stepped between us and the darkness. And for the first time, Jack Romano's face was not the cold mask I had grown used to. It was the face of a man who knew exactly what danger looked like, and had chosen not to let it touch us ever again. After Derek was removed from the estate, the entire house settled into a strange and heavy silence. No one spoke, yet I could feel that something fundamental had shifted. The afternoon drifted by like a thin layer of mist, blurred and muted, filled only with the ticking of the clock and the distant birdsong rising from the garden behind the house. I sat in the room with Ellie, trying to appear calm so she would not see the storm gathering inside me, but beneath my stillness was a terror without a name. Everything had seemed to be settling, finding a fragile balance, and then Derek appeared like a ghost, dragging me back into the darkest parts of my past. I knew he would not let me go easily, and I knew that the next time he came, it might not be just shouting and threats. As the sun began to set, a housemaid knocked on the door and told me Mr. Romano wanted to see me in the library. I told Ellie to lock the door and open it for no one, then stepped out. Each movement weighted as though I carried stones in my chest. The library was a quiet room lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, filled with soft light and the faint scent of old wood. Jack Romano stood with his back to me, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the large window. I entered, and for several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he turned with measured calm. Derek is a dangerous man. His tone was even, without anger, but also without the gentleness I had seen in him the past few nights. I know, I whispered, too drained to pretend otherwise. He stepped closer, his eyes cutting through every fragile barrier I had ever tried to build. I let him go this time. But if he returns, I will not use words again. He paused, and his voice lowered. I do not tolerate trouble on my own grounds. I could not tell whether to thank him or fear the steel behind his promise. There was something in his voice that made me shiver, not because he threatened violence, but because I believed he would follow through without hesitation. I sat in the chair near the fireplace, trying to steady myself. Mr. Romano sat across from me, his eyes never leaving mine. Rachel, you need to tell me the truth. What happened between you and that man? Why your daughter has bruises? Why a child believes she must work to save her mother? I lowered my head, my hands twisting together. For a moment, I wanted to run from that gaze, but I could not. Not anymore. I told him everything. About David, about the unraveling of my life after his death, about how Derek stepped in like a savior only to become a captor, about the nights I held Ellie, while fear pressed against my ribs. When I finished, my throat felt scraped raw, my heart pounding as if I had run miles. I had not cried while speaking, but when Mr. Romano did not answer right away, tears burned at the corners of my eyes. I am not a good mother, I whispered, a confession rising from somewhere deep inside. I let her live in fear for too long. He looked at me for a long time before speaking slowly. No one teaches us how to be parents in those circumstances, but you cannot allow it to continue. You must do something. I nodded as tears slipped free. I know. I just do not know where to begin. Mr. Romano stood, walked to his desk, and retrieved a thin folder which he handed to me. This is the address of an attorney. You need legal counsel. You need documentation to secure custody. You need a safe place to live. You need steady work you will not lose tomorrow. I stared at the papers in my hands. For the first time in years, I felt I was holding a real way out. I did not know why Jack Romano had done this, what reason a man like him might have to care about someone like me or my child. But I understood one thing clearly. I could not rely on the kindness of others alone. I had to save Ellie myself. I had to turn fear into strength. I had to step out of the darkness before it swallowed us whole. Tomorrow, I would begin. No more stepping back. No more running. Because this time, someone had seen us, and that small certainty was enough to keep me standing. I thought I might sleep peacefully after my conversation with Jack Romano, yet that night I tossed and turned until nearly dawn. Every time I closed my eyes, Derek appeared again at the estate gate, shouting my name, his voice swollen with threats. I saw Ellie's wide, terrified eyes, heard the pounding at the door like a fist striking inside my chest. Even with her curled against me, her small arms wrapped tight around my neck, I found no calm, because I knew everything that had happened was only temporary. Early the next morning, before the sun had climbed fully over the wall, I went to Jack's office. The heavy wooden door stood slightly open. Inside, he sat at his desk, turning the pages of a file. I lingered on the threshold until he lifted his gaze and settled his eyes on me as though he had already known I would come. He nodded. "Come in." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The room was so quiet I could hear each whisper of paper. I stood with my hands clasped, searching for the courage to speak. "I need you to help me with something." My voice was rough from worry. Jack did not answer, only watched me, and I took a breath deep enough to steady myself. I want you to make sure Derek never comes back, never comes near me or Ellie again. Not under any circumstances. The words left my mouth colder than I expected. The room held a deep stillness. Jack rested his elbows on the desk, his eyes fixed on me. You know who I am, do you not? I nodded, my heart thudding hard. I was not naive. I knew he had power, people, the means to make someone like Derek disappear from our lives if he chose to. But as he continued to look at me, I saw in his eyes not only scrutiny but a more complicated emotion I could not name. You are asking me to do something you may not be able to carry later. His voice dropped. I know, I said quickly, afraid my courage would collapse if I paused. I forgave Derek the first time, and the second. I stayed silent because I was scared, because I was poor, because I had no one on my side. But now there is Ellie, and I would rather be judged by the whole world than let her grow up afraid the way I did. Jack stood and walked to the window. He said nothing for a long moment, and I could not tell what ran through his mind. Hope and fear twisted inside me like two threads pulled tight together. At last he turned back. If I agree, you never speak of this again. Never. I nodded. If I do this, nothing will be simple afterward. You will owe me. Not money. Silence. I nodded again. Slower. Steadier. I understand. He held my gaze a few seconds longer, then returned to the desk and lifted the phone. You know what to do. His voice was calm, neither harsh nor loud, only one sentence. Then he ended the call. I stood there with my heart both relieved and close to breaking. I had crossed a line I never imagined I would. As I reached the doorway, his voice rose again, gentler this time. You are not a bad person, Rachel. But from now on, do not let anyone push you back into weakness. I stepped into the hallway where a draft of cool air brushed my skin. But for the first time I did not feel cold. Everything was clearer than ever. There are things no prayer or wish can fix. Some moments can only be changed with decisive action. And today I had chosen strength. Not for revenge, but for protection. For Ellie, and for myself. The next morning, the Romano estate was strangely quiet. I woke early, not to the sound of bells or the hurried footsteps of the cleaning staff, but to a restlessness that had settled low in my chest. It was not quite fear, not quite relief, but the feeling of standing on the narrow ledge between what had passed and what had yet to come. Ellie was still asleep, her face relaxed in dreams, one small hand loosely holding the edge of the blanket. I rose and stepped to the window. Outside, the sun had not yet reached high. The sky wore the pale gray of late October. It would likely be colder than the days before. When I came downstairs, Anthony was already waiting. Without a word, he led me to the library, where Jack Romano had been waiting, seated behind his desk. The room held the same stillness and quiet strength it had the first time I stepped inside. The air between us was heavy, as if one wrong movement might cause everything to unravel. Jack looked up as I entered. There was no smile, no warmth in his expression, only a small nod. He gestured for me to sit. Before him lay a black, leather-bound folder, sealed shut. I did not ask what it was. I was not even sure I wanted to know what he had done, or would do, to make Derek disappear. Because deep down, I already understood this much. There are some paths that, once taken, offer no way back. Jack placed his hand on the folder gently, as if it were a cup of hot tea. You have stepped into a world where the rules are different. From now on, every choice carries a cost. I nodded, willing my voice to stay steady. I understand. He studied me, not as a threat, but as someone measuring whether I was strong enough to keep my word. You cannot tell anyone about this. Not friends, not family, not the police. If one day this comes to light, I will assume it came from you, and I will not be forgiving. His voice was not loud, but each word landed like stone. I swallowed hard and replied, I will not speak of it. I only want safety for my daughter. I would never do anything to risk that. Jack nodded once, then slid the folder toward me, not for me to open, but as a symbol, a declaration without a signature. Everything had been handled. Derek would no longer be a problem. I did not ask what Jack had done. I did not want to know. I simply bowed my head and whispered, Thank you. Jack Romano leaned back in his chair, something in his eyes passing like a shadow of pity. You may call it gratitude, but do not mistake this for kindness. This is a transaction, not mercy. I nodded, because I had known that even before I stepped into the room. I left the library and walked down the long hallway, morning light streaking through the tall glass windows. My hands still trembled slightly. But inside me, everything was clearer than it had ever been. Derek would not come back. Ellie could sleep a full night without nightmares. I could walk into the rest of my life with my head held high, even if I carried a secret I could never reveal. And Jack Romano, the man I once believed to be cold and unreachable, had placed in my hands something the legal system never could. Justice. Not the kind found in courtrooms, but a justice spoken in another language, a language of power, of silence, and of absolute loyalty. From that moment on, I was no longer the woman I used to be. I was Ellie's mother, a woman who had stood her ground, and someone who, in some quiet way, now belonged to the world of Jack Romano, a world where there is no place for those who turn away from their word. The days that followed the silent agreement passed quietly, but they were far from dull. No one spoke Derek's name again. No one asked what had happened, as if everyone in the estate had silently agreed to hold their tongues for something greater than personal curiosity. And in that hush, something else began to stir, quietly but unmistakably, between me and Jack Romano. Not through sudden gestures or unnecessary words, but through presence. Through the way his gaze lingered when I passed in the hallway. Through the way he stepped into the kitchen each morning, pretending to ask about the menu even though I knew he did not care much about food. We began to share small things. One time, I left my notebook on the armchair in the sitting room. He picked it up and asked what I wrote so much about. When I told him it was just notes on Ellie's school schedule and our grocery budget for the week, he said nothing for a long moment, then nodded. I do not know why that simple exchange caught in my throat the way it did. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, someone looked at the details of my life with quiet respect, not pity or dismissal. One afternoon, Ellie ran into the library with a sheet of scribbled drawings. She said it was her dream house, and in the picture were 3 people standing in a garden, with a small brown dog. Jack looked at the drawing, then glanced at me, his mouth lifting slightly in a faint, unreadable smile. He said nothing, but in that look was something different. No longer the gaze of a man sheltering a mother and daughter out of obligation. It was the gaze of a man who had started to care. One night, I woke from a nightmare. In my dream, I was back in the old apartment, hearing Derek call my name from the kitchen. I sat up, gasping, my heart pounding. When I walked down to the kitchen to get water, I found Jack there too, holding a glass of wine, his eyes darkening slightly when he saw the panic still on my face. He did not ask. He poured another glass, set it on the table, and said quietly, "Sometimes the things that haunt us most aren't in the past. It's the fear they'll return at any moment." I said nothing, but I sat down across from him. We drank in silence, not to forget, but to quietly carry together what could not be named. From that night on, I stopped avoiding him, and he no longer held himself behind the shadows of power. We grew used to each other's presence. In the mornings he read the paper in the library, and I cleaned beside him. Sometimes he asked about Ellie, about school, about the dreams she once told him. I shared those stories, no longer guarded. Then I told him things no one had ever asked about. How I once wanted to study nursing but had to give it up. How I feared the ocean, even though I had never left the city. And Jack, the man I once believed had no weaknesses, told me about his mother, a strict Irish-Italian woman who loved classical music. The more we shared, the more the distance faded. No longer employer and housekeeper, no longer benefactor and debtor, just 2 people, once broken, relearning how to see each other without defense. And in the quiet spaces between our conversations, I began to recognize something I had not dared name, that I missed the way he looked at me when he turned away, that I hoped he would be there the next morning, with his coffee and newspaper, like a familiar part of this new life. That maybe, just maybe, what was forming between us was more than trust. It was something softer, warmer, and deeper than anything I had ever known. That evening, after Ellie had gone to bed, I remained in the library, holding a book I could not bring myself to read. The late autumn wind drifted through the slightly open window, carrying with it the scent of damp grass and a chill that settled deep in my chest. I did not know why I had not returned to my room. I only felt as though something had not yet settled. When Jack walked in, I was not startled. Perhaps I had grown used to his presence in the moments when I was most vulnerable. He moved slowly toward the bar, poured a glass of wine, then paused, as if weighing a decision. He turned to look at me, then lifted the bottle again, an unspoken invitation. I nodded. He poured another glass and handed it to me, his fingers grazing mine just briefly, but enough to stir something inside me. We said nothing for a long time. Only the soft golden light from the desk lamp fell across our faces, softening the lines that time and hardship had carved. I took a sip, felt the gentle bitterness slide down my throat, then asked the question I had carried in silence for so long. Why did you help me? Not out of duty. Not for Ellie. But truly, why me? Jack sat across from me, his gaze gentler now, no longer sharp and unreadable as it once was. He turned the glass slowly in his hand, then spoke with deliberate calm, as if listening to his own answer as he gave it. Because you never asked for help. You only asked for time. A chance to stand on your own. I have seen many people fall, but not everyone chooses to rise, no matter what it takes, the way you did. I sat still. There was something in his voice that made me feel seen, not through the lens of my wounds, but through the quiet strength I had tried so long to hide. I smiled faintly, then asked without thinking, "And who helped you get back up?" Jack did not smile, but his eyes dimmed. No one. I taught myself how not to need that. He leaned back, a rare motion that revealed the weariness he usually kept hidden. My heart ached unexpectedly. This man, I realized, had likely carried far more than anyone knew. I stood and walked toward him, not for any particular reason, just because it felt right. When I drew near, he looked up, and for the first time, his gaze was not a barrier. It was a bridge. I sat beside him. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us reached out. But the silence was not heavy. It was an understanding that what was unfolding did not need to be named. Then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, my shoulder brushed against his, a touch so light it made me shiver. I did not pull away, and he did not move aside. Jack merely tilted his head, resting his forehead lightly against mine. A simple gesture, yet filled with quiet emotion. It was not a kiss, not possession. It was shared empathy, deep and wordless, between two souls who had known what it meant to break. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I was not Rachel, the woman who had flinched through countless nights, not the mother burdened with guilt for what her child had witnessed. I was simply a woman, sitting beside a man who had, in his own quiet way, stood beside her like a wall that would not crack. And for the first time in so many years, I allowed myself to feel, not fear, not doubt, just feel, that I was no longer alone, that somewhere in the quiet corners of this life, something truly tender had begun. Life did not change overnight after that moment, but something had shifted ever so slightly within me. It felt as if a door had quietly opened, and this time I was no longer afraid to step through it. I began piecing my life back together, little by little, through small tasks that carried great meaning. The first was returning to school. Years ago, I had started a short nursing program at a community college, but had to abandon it when Ellie was born, and then came the lost years with Derek. Now, with things finally settling into a fragile calm, I returned to that old longing. Jack said nothing when I brought up enrolling again. He simply took me to meet a woman named Rosa, who ran an organization supporting women who had survived abuse. She was an old friend of his mother's. Rosa looked at me for a long while, then asked just one question. "How many women like you do you want to help?" That question kept me up the entire night. And by the next morning, I had become a volunteer with the organization. At first, I helped organize files, answered phones, took notes during group meetings, but then I realized I could do more. I began telling my story, not in full, not with the darkest details, but just enough so that frightened young women could see they were not alone, that there was a path forward. I learned how to facilitate sharing circles. I learned how to lead groups. And over time, I became part of that network, a small but steady link in a chain of support. Ellie began to change too. She laughed more. She no longer flinched at the sound of a door slamming shut, no longer startled when a stranger entered the room. She made friends with a few neighborhood children near the estate, learned to ride a bicycle, and even took swimming lessons in the backyard pool with a private coach Jack had quietly arranged. Each night, she would do her homework at the long table in the library, and I would sit beside her, reading materials for my course or preparing notes for the next week's meeting. Sometimes we said nothing, but just being near each other softened the edge of the day. Jack continued to live his life with the same calm, mysterious rhythm, but he was always present in the moments that mattered. When I received my certificate for completing the first advanced training course, he attended the ceremony in person, saying nothing, but standing at the back of the hall with a look of quiet pride in his eyes. When Ellie had her first school performance, he did not sit in the front row like I did, but waited in the mosque, back, silently. Still, I knew she had seen him, because after her part ended, she ran straight into his arms without hesitation. I realized I had found something even more precious than peace. I had found a support system, a circle of people who did not need to say much, who did not make grand gestures, but who were always there when it mattered. And more importantly, I realized I had changed. I was no longer a woman surviving on reflexes shaped by fear. I was a woman living by choice. I chose to love my daughter the right way. I chose to reach out to others who had once stood where I had. And I chose to look ahead, toward the light, even if it sometimes flickered faintly like the first pale rays of a winter morning. But I knew then that I was walking in the right direction. And for the first time, I was not just surviving, I was truly living. Change did not arrive with a declaration or in a moment of dramatic revelation. It came quietly, through the smallest things, repeated again and again until they became habit. Like how every morning Ellie would run down to the kitchen first, where Jack was already seated with his coffee and newspaper. She would pour herself some milk, sit across from him, and tell him about what had happened at school the day before. No one had asked for that ritual to begin, but somehow it had taken root, day after day. I was no longer a guest in the Romano estate. I knew where every cup belonged in the kitchen cabinets, which button on the heater remote tended to stick, the name of the gardener, and even the nickname he used for Jack when he thought no one was listening. Dinner for the three of us became a normal thing. There was no more distance, no more silence out of politeness. We talked. About Ellie's lessons, about the new projects at the organization I had joined, sometimes even about the little nonsense of the day that made Jack smile quietly. He was never a man of many words, but his presence was enough to fill the room. One afternoon, Ellie brought home a drawing she'd made. She said it was her family. In it, there were 3 people, holding hands beneath a roof. I was on the left, Ellie in the middle, and Jack on the right, wearing a gray suit like he always did. She even drew the neighbor's dog, saying one day we absolutely had to get one of our own. I stared at that drawing for a long time. There was something warm rising in my chest that I couldn't name. Jack was leaning against the doorframe, watching the two of us, his eyes softened. No one said anything, but I knew he felt the shift too. That was when I understood. We didn't need titles. We didn't need definitions. We were already a family, in our own quiet way. Not because we shared a roof, but because we chose to show up in each other's lives, every single day. Ellie no longer asked about her biological father. I didn't know whether she had forgotten, or simply no longer needed a different figure to take his place. To her, Jack was the one who taught her how to wash the car, who took her to buy new sneakers, who didn't say much but always listened long enough to make her feel heard. And to me, he was the man who never demanded gratitude or remembrance. He let me grow into this new life on my own terms, but he was always there, steady, if I ever needed a hand. Once, Rosa asked me if I had thought about leaving, starting over somewhere new, building a life entirely on my own. I just smiled. I had already done that, the day I chose to stay. The day I chose not to run from feelings, not to run from the connections slowly forming in my heart. My new life did not begin when I left something behind. It began when I accepted that I deserved love, safety, and a true family, even if that family had begun on a rainy night, with a cup of warm chocolate and a silent gaze. But from those small and quiet beginnings, I found myself again, and so did Ellie. She was not just recovering, she was growing, day by day, in a home filled with laughter, with dinner on the table, and with 2 grown-ups who had chosen to stay, not out of duty, but because of love. That family is real, and it is ours. That afternoon the weather turned cold without warning. I had just left the office after a long meeting at the organization and decided to drive myself back to the estate instead of letting the driver pick me up as usual. I only wanted a little quiet for myself after a day packed with schedules, or so I told my own tired mind. The parking garage was in the basement, dimly lit with the damp scent of old concrete lingering in the air. I walked toward my car, searching for my keys and my bag, when I heard a small sound behind me. Footsteps, light, but unmistakable. I turned, saw no one. My heartbeat quickened for a moment, and I almost laughed it off, telling myself someone must have simply walked by. But when I started to turn back to my car, a shadow lunged out of the darkness. I had no time to react. I was shoved hard, against the side of the car, my head striking the window, my vision exploding into stars. A rough hand clamped around my throat. The smell of alcohol, cheap cigarettes, and something far more familiar than I wished to remember crashed over me at once. Derek. I knew him even before I could see his face. Those crazed eyes, that heavy breath, still the same as the last time I faced him. You thought you got away, did you, Rachel? Thought hiding in some mafia man's house would keep you safe. His voice was gravel and hatred. I struggled, tried to push him off, but he was too strong and I was too stunned. His hand slipped to my shoulder, yanked my purse away, then returned to my throat as if he could crush the life from me with sheer rage. I lost everything because of you. I will not let you rest. He spat the words, eyes wild. I do not know what happened next. Everything blurred. But just before the world went black, I heard a shout. A deep voice, sharp, echoing through the entire garage. Then I felt myself pulled away, not with violence but with strength, solid and unshakable. Through my fading sight, I caught the familiar outline of Jack before darkness swallowed all of it. When I opened my eyes, the white light overhead made me squint. I was in the estate's medical room. The smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of the heart monitor reminded me of the first time I woke in a hospital after Derek had beaten me years ago. But this time I was not alone. Jack sat beside me, his face more tense than I had ever seen it. I tried to move, but he laid a hand on my shoulder, gentle yet firm. Do not. Just stay still. I whispered one word. Ellie. She is safe. Anthony picked her up from school and brought her home the moment we heard. I closed my eyes as tears rose, not from pain but from the sheer collapse of emotion. I had thought it was over. I had believed Derek would never return, but I had been wrong. Jack tightened his hand around mine. I let this go too far. He sounded as if he were speaking to himself more than to me. I gave him a second chance because you asked me to, but this time I will not show mercy. His voice was steel. In his eyes I saw something deeper than anger. It was a promise that no one would ever again have the power to frighten me or Ellie. I knew he was a man who kept his word, because he did not simply speak it. He lived it in every choice he made. And as I lay there, my body weak and aching, my heart trembled not with fear but with the stunned realization that I was no longer alone. Someone had chosen to protect me, not out of duty, but because he wanted to. And this time, I would not ask for leniency. I would let him do what needed to be done. For me, for Ellie, for us. The next morning, the rain came. Heavy drops pelted the villa's tiled roof with a steady, rhythmic insistence, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away something that had settled thickly in the air. I sat by my bedroom window, a blanket draped loosely over my shoulders, the cup of tea in my hands long gone cold. Down in the garden, wilted leaves scattered across the soaked earth, their faded colors bleeding into the mud. I hadn't spoken to Jack since that night in the parking lot. He hadn't pushed me to. But the silence between us was far from comforting. It felt more like a pause before something irreversible, like standing at the edge of a decision that neither of us wanted to make but both knew was coming. When Anthony knocked on the door and said Jack was waiting for me in the library, I wasn't surprised. I just felt a small tightening in my chest. I knew what he was going to say, and I knew I had already thought about it too. Maybe walking away really was the safest choice. When I entered the room, Jack was standing with his back to me, looking out the window. He didn't turn around. Not immediately. It was only after a few long seconds that his voice came, low and steady. I can take you and Ellie, somewhere else. A different city, a small house, a place where no one knows your names. I can make everything disappear. You'll be safe. I froze. Not because I hadn't expected it, but because of how he said it. It didn't sound like an offer. It felt like a quiet surrender. I walked closer. My shoulder still ached faintly where Derek had grabbed me the night before, but that wasn't where the real pain lived. The deeper hurt came from watching Jack push away the very thing he most wanted to hold on to. I sat down across from him, met his eyes. If I leave, will that make you feel safer? He was silent for a moment. Then he turned to face me, and there was something in his eyes, darker and colder than usual. You're the first person I've been afraid to lose in years. That's the truth. I didn't answer. I just set the teacup on the table and folded my hands together to keep them from trembling. He thought leaving would protect me, but he didn't understand. I had spent my whole life running. From David, from Derek, from the parts of myself I didn't want to face. I was used to retreating, but not this time. This time, I was choosing to stay. He didn't look away. There was a struggle in him. I could see it clearly. Maybe he believed his world was too dangerous for people like me and Ellie. But he had forgotten one thing. I was no longer the woman who had sat trembling at the doorstep of this house, clothes stained and eyes lost. I had survived. I had stood back up. And I had learned how to protect my daughter at all costs. Even if it meant staying in Jack Romano's world, I'm not going anywhere, because this is my home. That sentence hung in the room like an arrow, loose straight into the heart of fear. Jack didn't respond right away. But then he stepped forward, slowly. He sat beside me, and his hand reached out to rest lightly on mine. No pressure, just a touch. But I knew what it meant. It was agreement. It was acceptance that from now on, we would no longer ask ourselves whether to walk away. Because we had already chosen. And that choice was to remain. Together. Despite everything we didn't yet know, I had never been more certain of anything in my life. That no matter how the world spun or trembled, I would not retreat again. I would reach for what was right in front of me. A chance at a life that felt real. A love that needed no proving. And a family that didn't have to be perfect, only whole. That morning, the sky was clear as glass, the air washed clean by days of relentless rain. I was in the backyard with Ellie, tending to the new flower beds we had planted in the far corner. She was full of energy, scooping up dirt with both hands, her sleeves rolled high, tiny smudges of mud dotting her cheeks while her eyes sparkled with joy. I sat beside her, gently guiding her on how deep to place each seedling, my heart strangely light. After everything, perhaps this was what I had once dreamed of, a quiet morning where Ellie could simply be a child. When Jack stepped out from the hallway holding a towel, I didn't think much of it beyond the idea that he would join us for tea. He came over and wiped Ellie's hands with a tenderness he only ever showed when he was near her. Then he told her to go inside, wash up, and bring out the family photo album so he could show her someone very special. I watched Ellie run off, and quietly assumed he was going to tell her again about his mother, as he had before. But this time, when it was just the two of us, Jack turned to me, and there was something in his gaze that wasn't the usual calm. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box in a deep shade of blue. The moment I saw it, my heart skipped a beat. He opened it. Inside was a delicate ring, set with a pale green stone. Nothing extravagant, nothing loud, just something heartbreakingly beautiful. Jack didn't kneel. He simply sat there across from me, holding the box as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. His voice was low, steady. I don't have a clean past. I don't have a predictable future, but I have one certainty. I want to spend whatever is left of my life with you and Ellie. If you'll allow me, I'd like to call the two of you my family. I want to marry you. And if Ellie agrees, I want to make her my legal daughter. I couldn't answer right away. The tears came, not just from emotion but from a kind of gratitude that reached into the deepest parts of me. This man, who had once been distant and guarded, was now placing his entire heart into my hands and my daughter's, without hesitation. I nodded, unable to speak, simply reaching out my hand. He slipped the ring onto my finger, his hand trembling just slightly, but his eyes never left mine. It was the first time I had seen Jack Romano reveal even a hint of vulnerability. And I realized then, I loved that part of him too. When Ellie returned, arms wrapped around the photo album, Jack and I both turned to her. He gestured for her to sit between us. His voice came slowly, carefully, as if to make sure she understood every word. "Sweetheart, would you be okay if Uncle Jack officially became your dad?" Ellie's eyes widened. Then she looked at me. I nodded, tears falling freely. She didn't say a word. She just threw her arms around Jack, burying her face in his chest like she had finally found the place she had always been searching for. Jack held her close, his eyes closing gently. And in that moment, I understood something profound. We were no longer two people trying to patch together our broken pieces. We were three people who had chosen one another, accepted one another, and become the most complete thing I had ever known. A family, true, and right on time. After the morning Jack proposed and asked to adopt Ellie, something in the house felt irrevocably changed, though on the surface, nothing looked different. The same kitchen greeted us with its quiet warmth, the same dinners were shared between the three of us, and the gentle strains of the piano still drifted through the living room each evening as Ellie practiced her newest piece. Yet among us, something had shifted. No longer were we just people trying to reach through the fog of our pasts. We had become a family, walking forward together without hesitation. The adoption process moved more swiftly than I had imagined. Jack had prepared everything in advance, quietly, in the way he always did. Standing before the judge, he looked her in the eye, his voice not loud but carrying a quiet strength. "I share no blood with this child, but I will protect her as if she were my own. I will stand by her through every important moment of her life, and I will never walk away, not for any reason." I glanced at Ellie, who was gripping my hand tightly. She wasn't crying, but there was such unwavering trust and brightness in her gaze that I had to look away to hide the tears welling in mine. That evening, after we returned home, we had a small dinner in the backyard, just a handful of people who mattered. Rosa came and wrapped me in an embrace like she had just witnessed a miracle take form. From a short distance, Anthony lifted his glass in quiet celebration, his eyes softer and warmer than I had ever seen. Ellie wore a cream-colored dress, its edges trimmed with lace I had sewn myself, her hair tied back with a purple ribbon, her face lit with the glow of the setting sun. She darted between the table and the grill, eagerly telling everyone that from now on, she would have a real dad, someone to take her to school in the mornings when her mom was busy, someone who would attend parent-teacher meetings, and someone who would teach her how to play chess without ever pretending to lose. I sat at the wooden table, watching it all unfold, and felt a quiet settle in my heart. Not the fragile stillness I had once known, but a peace built from trust, from all the storms we had weathered together, from a love that needed no vows to prove its depth. Jack took the seat beside me, his hand resting gently over mine. He didn't say a word, but the way his fingers closed around mine told me everything. That from this day on, I would no longer face the world alone. We were a family, not bound by blood, not sharing a name, but sharing a heart that beat for one another. Sharing dinners that felt complete not because of what was on the table, but because of who was there. Sharing sunlit mornings filled with the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the rooms. And even in the darkest hours, when I woke from a nightmare and reached out, there was always someone beside me, holding me close, whispering that everything was different now. This family was not born out of perfection. It rose from the cracks, from the moments we stumbled, from the courage it took to open our hearts again. And for that reason, it was stronger than anything I had ever known. After all these years, I could finally call happiness by its true name, not with a sigh of longing, but with a smile that reached all the way to my soul. That morning, the sun rose early and brighter than usual, casting golden light through the leaves in the backyard where we had chosen to hold the wedding. Sunlight spilled gently over each neatly arranged chair, painting everything it touched with warmth. There was no grand hall, no expensive silk ribbons, no sweeping orchestras. Just simple white flowers lining the narrow aisle and a few dozen familiar faces seated in 2 quiet rows, each wearing a tender smile. Rosa sat in the front, her eyes red-rimmed but glowing with joy. Anthony stood beside Jack, shoulders straight, his gaze filled with pride he made no effort to hide. Ellie, in a dress of soft white, held my hand as we stepped across the threshold of the home we had built together through the days and seasons now folded behind us. She leaned in just before the music began, whispering into my ear, "Mom, don't cry. Today is your most beautiful day." I tightened my grip around her fingers. That one sentence stirred something deep within me, a cascade of feeling that rose like the tide. I walked slowly, step by step, toward the man waiting for me, through the light of a new morning, through a breeze that stirred the dew still clinging to the blossoms. Jack stood there in a pale gray suit. He did not smile broadly, but his eyes held a tenderness I had never seen so clearly. As I came to stand before him, the world around us seemed to soften into a hush. There was only the steady rhythm of my heart and the whisper of the wind, carrying something old and true and never quite forgotten. The officiant began to speak, not with grand declarations or rigid vows, but with a quiet truth. "Today is not about 2 people choosing each other out of necessity," he said. "It is about 2 people choosing each other completely, because they want to live not just beside one another, but with one another, fully." When it came time for me to speak, my voice trembled slightly but never broke. "I don't promise to be the perfect wife, because I am not perfect. But I promise to be honest, to stay by your side in the light and when darkness falls. I promise to speak when silence would hurt more. I promise not to leave when things grow difficult, and to remind myself, every day, that this love is a choice I continue to make." Jack listened with an intensity that etched every word into his heart. And when he spoke, I heard that familiar voice, filled with a warmth no melody could ever replicate. "I don't know if anything lasts forever, he said. "But I know I want to spend all the time I have left protecting you and our daughter. I promise to be your shelter, your shoulder, the place you can return to when the world outside feels too heavy. And if one day I'm no longer here, I want you to remember that you were once loved with everything inside a man who thought he'd never be capable of love." The applause that followed wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was gentle, a soft wave that broke the stillness that had wrapped around us. Ellie ran forward then, her steps light, and handed us the rings. When Jack slipped the band onto my finger, his hands trembled ever so slightly. I took his hand in mine, our eyes locking, and in that moment, I knew this memory would stay with me for the rest of my life. Not because of ceremony or grandeur, but because of how utterly real it was. The celebration afterward was as simple as we were. A long wooden table laid with cakes, tea, fresh fruit, and soft music flowing from a small speaker perched on the windowsill. Ellie danced across the grass with the neighborhood children, her laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon in the wind. Jack and I sat side by side, fingers intertwined, saying nothing, because peace had already said everything there was to say. That wedding was not a happy ending. It was a beginning, the start of a life where I no longer had to brace myself against every storm, where I could sit beside the man I loved, watching our daughter laugh beneath the noonday sun, and know with absolute certainty that peace was real. And this time, it had chosen to stay. 1 year after the wedding, my life had changed in ways I never dared to imagine. I woke each morning in a house filled with light, to the sound of Ellie's laughter echoing from the kitchen as Jack taught her how to make pancakes. I no longer jolted awake from nightmares, no longer froze when the phone rang or when someone knocked unexpectedly at the door. My days were no longer just strung together for the sake of survival. They had become moments fully lived, moments that felt complete in every quiet, beautiful way. I worked at the organization I had helped build, supporting women who had endured what I once did. Jack supported every decision I made, sometimes quietly from behind, sometimes by stepping forward and opening doors so I could walk farther than I ever thought I could. And Ellie was growing up wrapped in love, safe in the kind of care that gently mended what had once been frayed. She had known fear once, but now she knew what it meant to trust, to be loved unconditionally, without needing to earn it. There was a time I believed true love was something meant for other people, never for someone like me. But I've come to understand that sometimes happiness doesn't arrive like a lightning strike. Sometimes it comes in the form of quiet repetition, a warm meal shared at the end of the day, an embrace when it matters most, a glance that says, without a word, "I see you, and I'm here." My story is proof that even if you've been broken, even if you've been made to believe you are unworthy, love can still find you if you're willing to take one more step, to trust one more time. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. What did you feel on this journey with Rachel and Jack, as they found their way from darkness to light? Was there a moment that reached into your heart? We would love to hear from you, your thoughts, your reflections, your own story if you feel like sharing. Because here, we listen with our hearts. If you're moved by stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Dear Single Mom. Like, share, and help us spread this message of love and healing. Each day, we bring you stories that touch the soul, nurture hope, and gently restore your faith in life. Thank you for walking alongside us. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and the kind of peace that stays. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next video.